Hello, I'm Michael Pearson. This is The Human Condition. You may be asking why I'm not wearing my red glasses, and it's because it's close to noon. So when I shoot sometimes close to noon, I don't worry so much about the blue light, and I will have plenty of access to being out in the sun. If I'm shooting and it's not near noon where I am in Denver or in other places when I shoot sometimes, you'll see me usually wear the red glasses. So we're talking about circadian rhythms in that case. Our topic today is adrenal fatigue types. So we're going to talk about adrenal fatigue and the different phases and types and stages that people go through. And there are several different sources of discussion on this, and some break it down into like 3 stages, and some break it down into 10 or 12 or less than 10. And I don't really want to bog you down with that. I want to get to the general concept of what is happening. What is happening in adrenal dysfunction from start to finish, from early stage to late adrenal exhaustion, because this isn't really recognized as a medical condition. Although I will say that in the past, we probably looked at late adrenal function as what used to be called nervous breakdown. So nervous breakdown was this idea that a person was shaky, that they couldn't stand up, they had to lay down, they got dizzy, they were hypoglycemic, they couldn't really sleep, they were inconsolable, they were stressed, sometimes they were shaking, they were just super stressed out and they couldn't handle life, they couldn't go to work, and everyone would whisper about the condition. And it was just a very strange thing because it didn't correspond with any medical condition. It was just kind of like they're wiped out and we don't know what's wrong with them. And it really wasn't heart disease, it wasn't liver disease, it wasn't pancreas disease, it wasn't bone disease. It was just like, or their lungs. What was wrong with them? They were just kind of had to lay down and couldn't deal with life. And that was late stage adrenal dysfunction called nervous breakdown. It was often psychiatric diagnosis, and it had to do with people that were overwhelmed by stress, because that absolutely fits with adrenal dysfunction. And then these people can be overstressed. It can be in both men and women. It can be in elderly or youth, and it can come on at any time, and you can move through the stages very rapidly, or you can move through them very slowly over decades. So very generally, the late stage ones take years to get, but if you're under a whole lot of stress, you could move from early to late in weeks very easily. The first thing I like to talk about is, again, I don't get any kickbacks for any of this stuff, but I want to tell you what I use. I really like the Dutch urine lab test for looking at cortisol and adrenal hormones and the whole gamut of sex hormones in both men and women, and I like to look at their lab. They do a urine collection that is 4 or 5 different urine collections during a 24-hour period, and you freeze the urine. I'm sorry, in this case, you don't freeze the urine. The urine is a dry collection where you collect the urine wet on a card that you've labeled, and then you let it dry on a stand, because the card is a folding up card, and it stands up on the countertop. So you pee on it, you shake it out after you've written the date and time on it, and you've laid them out and prepared for this. And so at the given time, you pee on it, you shake it out, you stand it up on your counter, you let it dry for 24 hours. And when the final one has been dried for 24 hours, you can then package them up and mail them without freezing, because there's no wet liquid, it's all dry. And then that sample goes to the lab in the United States, and they analyze it, and they send you back these beautiful graphs and charts of what's happening with your sex hormones and what's happening with your adrenal hormones. So cortisol and DHEA and other breakdown products of this process. Also, at the end of that lab, they look at epinephrine, because epinephrine is relevant to the adrenal function. Now, there are other labs that do saliva, and that's perfectly fine. I love saliva. Both urine and saliva will have free hormone in it, and cortisol is quite stable in the saliva and the urine. Now, testosterone is not so much, and other hormones are not so much stable in saliva and urine. So you can't necessarily test every hormone at every time in the saliva or urine, and it changes based on your stress level and the time of day. So I'm not saying you can't get good markers for the sex hormones and for the adrenal hormones in saliva. You can, but you've got to be very careful to use the right laboratories and use the right procedures and follow all the instructions about certain foods you're not supposed to eat beforehand, how you do the collection, and all of that stuff. So some of them will be frozen collections where you actually pee into a little cup and you freeze that and then mail it in frozen overnight. And others is, as I described earlier. So we're looking at not just whether your cortisol is high or low, because people come up to me and they say, okay, doc, I've got high cortisol or I've got low cortisol. And I know they don't really understand their system, because you don't really have high or low cortisol. You've got an interrupted rhythm, because there should be this curve from morning till night that really starts to peak at about 7 or 8 a.m. in cortisol, where cortisol rises and then it falls, and then it stays low the rest of the day and night until it rises again the next morning if you're healthy. And so there's a certain band of healthiness of how much your cortisol should rise and then drop. And the reason, many reasons that cortisol rises in the morning is because you're trying to deal with breakfast. You're trying to deal with breaking a fast. You've fasted for a period of time that you've been asleep since you last ate a meal, which was probably dinner the night before, and your body needs to mobilize blood sugar, and cortisol does that. So when you wake up, your adrenal glands are triggered by essentially light that you see and light that you feel and light that your body perceives with and without your eyes. Your skin has light receptors, your eyes have light receptors, and you perceive that light, and the process begins, and that's partly based on what the day before was like as well, not just today, but the day before, and the light streaming in your window or whatever's happening. So as you wake up, the circadian rhythm begins of the cortisol rising, and that cortisol comes from your adrenal glands back behind your back above your kidneys, right here at the bottom of your ribs. And they secrete the hormones, the cortisol and epinephrine, and that process rises, and then your liver is told by this hormone, cortisol, to release blood sugar, to release glycogen from the liver, and that comes out of the liver as glucose. And that circulates in the blood, and now you have blood sugar. So now you can deal with the day, and that's a reasonable thing. If you're super hypoglycemic, your body might secrete more cortisol, and you might have a very higher cortisol response. If you've been weakened and your adrenal glands are weakened, you might have inadequate cortisol surge in the morning. And that normal surge just can't do it, and you get a flat line where every data point is just flat across the day, and you really don't see a normal biologic surge of cortisol in the morning. There's also DHEA, which is a precursor hormone, dehydroepiandrosterone, which is a molecule that is formed out of cholesterol, that's formed from pregnenolone. And that molecule is a precursor, it's the granddaddy precursor to sex hormones and to stress hormones. So if you have a problem with this DHEA, you might have difficulty not only with making stress hormones and balancing them like cortisol and adrenaline, but also the sex hormones, testosterone and estrogen and progesterone and all the subgroups of estrogen, estrogen 1, estrogen 2, estrogen 3, and the breakdown products of testosterone like the androstenedione and other types of molecules that are androgens in both men and women, and also in the breakdown products of estrogen, which are molecules that are the ones that if they build up too high can lead to estrogen-based cancers. So we want to have all this balanced by making sure our adrenals are in very good shape. Not just ovaries and testes that make the sex hormones, but these sex hormones are also made in the adrenal glands, especially after menopause in women and after menopause in men. So the cholesterol synthesis is really important, and so that means we need choline, we need to have adequate cholesterol, we need to eat butter, we need to eat foods that have cholesterol in them, like egg yolks. We need to have enough carbohydrates or calories if we're eating carbohydrates. If we're not eating carbohydrates, we don't need any. We just need enough calories. We just need enough protein and fat, and we can synthesize cholesterol from that. As a person gets more stressed out, what'll happen is usually their cortisol levels will go up, and they'll overcompensate, and then their DHEA will stay about the same. And then later on, you might see their DHEA levels go up too. And then you might see some combination where the DHEA levels start to go down and the cortisol goes down. And then you'll see that the cortisol goes down even further and flatlines, and DHEA might be abnormally high with a low cortisol, or it might be low. And ultimately at the end stage of the most late stage of adrenal dysfunction, everything's flatlined. The cortisol is flatlined, it never surges, the DHEA is low, abnormally low. And in fact, we look at DHEA sulfide as the more accurate measure of DHEA, not DHEA, but DHEA sulfide. We also might find that a person has a cortisol awakening response that's blunted. Now, the cortisol awakening response just inserts one more measurement in the middle of all this, which is 30 minutes after awakening, we do another measure of cortisol in the urine or in the saliva to see if the person has awakened very nicely. Because you should wake up within 30 minutes of really realizing that you're conscious. You should feel quite awake and not need stimulants like caffeine or nicotine or other types of stimulants to feel like you're awake. Your own cortisol should do that to you. So if you don't have adequate cortisol 30 minutes after awakening, so you would wake up first, urinate, and then 30 minutes later urinate again, and you don't need very much. You just need enough to get the card wet for the Dutch test particularly. And then you can measure all this and have the CAR, or the cortisol awakening response, that 30-minute response done. That's how it looks, is it starts out as a normal curve and adequate levels, which are reflected in the lab. And then we start seeing higher cortisol, then higher DHEA, then lower cortisol, then lower DHEA, and ultimately a flat line. And so it goes up and up and up and down and down and down, and then the end. Now, there's one more thing to talk about with regard to this, which is the epinephrine levels. Epinephrine can be completely different. At the end stage, it'll be low just like everything else, but epinephrine can be measured in blood, urine, saliva. And epinephrine, or adrenaline, is something that's really important for sleep. It's really important for learning. It's really important for circadian rhythms. It's important for stress response. So it can work independently. And in fact, different blood types have different responses based on when cortisol and adrenaline respond, and whether it's long or short-term stress. And you can dive into that with another video with me. The blue light exposure is a big problem. EMF exposure is a big problem that can screw all this up. I like to use the Pulsetto device, which is a vagal stimulator that goes around your neck. It's a really cool device. It's about $300. There's a HRV devices that go in your ears, and those range from about $100 to about $800. There's neurofeedback, which you can do with a professional, where you go to a professional and they hook up wires to your brain and do neurofeedback. You can do sleep tracker apps, from super cheap ones that are just audio sensors or motion sensors that sense your mattress moving, or that you wear a ring, or you wear something on your finger, or you wear a device around your chest. Those are home sleep tracker apps. Those vary in price from less than $100 to hundreds and hundreds or thousands of dollars. And some of them are administered by doctors, like sleep dentists and sleep specialists will send people home with these sleep tracker apps. Some of them will wear a cap and measure brain waves, and some will not. But there is one more thing to talk about with regard to blood work, and this is in a blood test, not in urine or saliva, and it's called sex hormone binding globulin. And sex hormone binding globulin is a protein that carries your sex hormones in the blood, and it's really important to measure that, because sometimes the relationship between SHBG and DHEA goes up and down. So you might see sometimes a reciprocal relationship where when sex hormone binding globulin is down, DHEA is up, and vice versa, but I wouldn't hang my hat on that because it's highly variable. So just know that you want to make sure that SHBG, or sex hormone binding globulin, is normal, and so is DHEA, not just cortisol. And you don't just do one cortisol lab. In fact, when people go to the doctor, typically they'll do a blood test and they'll measure cortisol and DHEA and their sex hormones, and it'll be normal. And the problem is it doesn't measure 4 or 5 collection points, which are different times of the day that measure that curve. And so that's largely useless. And it tells you you don't have a tumor, but it doesn't really tell you that your body is functioning properly. So realize that sometimes the urine and saliva, and sometimes blood, which would be free hormones, is more expensive, but that's how you get the free hormones. The free hormones are hormones that are unbound. About 97% of your hormones are bound to some protein in blood, and in blood about 1 to 3% are free and can travel around like naked little kids, and they don't have anything binding them. So they're completely free. So these naked hormones don't have anything bound to them, and they're called free hormones, and they're naturally free in saliva and urine, but they're also can be tested for in blood, but they're more expensive. And your doctor doesn't tend to order those free hormones in your blood. So if you got a blood test for your testosterone or your estrogen or your cortisol or your DHEA, it's probably total, it's probably not free. And they're not wrong, because they're looking for a disease, they're looking for an illness, they're looking for a tumor, they're looking for some awful illness, and they're not looking for functional testing. So you can't blame them, but you have to understand that they're looking for disease and we're looking for ideal function. So they're two different targets of what the doctor's looking for. I hope you enjoyed our discussion of the adrenal function and the adrenal fatigue types.